Hominins. Standing up, growing brains, becoming human. The footprints. About 3.5 million years ago, a volcano in what is now Tanzania coughed out a layer of fine ash across the plain. Then it rained. The ash turned to something like wet cement. Animals walked across it, guinea fowl, hares, elephants, an extinct 3-toed horse, and left their tracks in it. And then the sun came out and baked the surface hard, and more ash fell on top, and it stayed buried for 3.5 million years. In 1976, at a site called Lidley, a team working with Mary Leakey found the tracks. And among them, running for more than 20 meters, was a line of prints that stopped everybody cold. They were footprints. Not paw prints. Not the knuckle drags of an ape. Footprints with a rounded heel that struck first, a weight roll along the outer edge, a proper arch in the middle, and a big toe pointing straight forward, parallel to the others, pushing off at the end of the stride. There are no knuckle marks anywhere. Whatever made these tracks was not using its hands. Its hands were somewhere else entirely, held up off the ground, doing nothing at all, or perhaps carrying something. 2 individuals walked side by side. There may have been a third, walking behind one of them, stepping deliberately into the leader's prints. They are your footprints. If you walked across wet sand today and someone cast the impression, it would look substantially like this. And here is the fact that should stop you, and that this whole chapter turns on. The creatures who made those prints had brains the size of a chimpanzee's. They were about 3.5 feet tall. They had ape faces, ape teeth, ape-sized skulls, and no tools that we know of, and no fire and no language, and no art, and no reason to think they were any cleverer than a chimp. And they walked exactly like you. Everything you have been taught about human evolution, the picture in your head, the one with the shambling ape gradually straightening up and getting smarter as it goes, has the story backwards. We did not become clever and then stand up. We stood up. And then, for 3 million years, absolutely nothing happened. The ladder that never existed. Before we go further, 2 corrections. Both of them matter, and both of them are about pictures in your head. First, the March of Progress. You know the image. A stooped knuckle-walking ape on the left, and then a series of figures, each straighter and taller and more naked than the last, marching left to right, ending in a striding modern man. It is one of the most successful pieces of misinformation in the history of science. It was drawn as an illustration for a 1965 book. It was never meant as a claim about the fossil record. And it has done more damage to public understanding of human evolution than any creationist ever managed, because it plants a single idea so firmly that people can't shake it. That human evolution was a line. It wasn't. It was a bush, not a chain of ancestors, each one a bit better than the last. A branching, sprawling, wasteful radiation of dozens of hominin species, most of them dead ends, most of them going extinct without issue, many of them alive at the same time as each other, sometimes standing on the same landscape and looking at each other across a river. For nearly the entire 7 million year history of our lineage, there were several kinds of human alive at once. Not ancestors and descendants. Contemporaries. Cousins. Neighbors. Today there is one. That is not the normal state of affairs. That is a bizarre, recent, and, when you sit with it, genuinely unsettling anomaly, and it is going to be the last thing this chapter tells you. Second, chimpanzees are not our ancestors. We did not evolve from chimps. A chimpanzee is not a primitive human, not an earlier draft, not a rung below us on any ladder. A chimpanzee is a cousin, and it has been evolving for exactly as long as we have, 6 or 7 million years, from the same common ancestor in a different direction, solving different problems, becoming something that no more resembles that ancestor than we do. And the ancestor we shared was not a chimpanzee. It was probably not even a knuckle walker, since there's good reason to think knuckle walking was invented separately by chimps and by gorillas, after both had split from us. Which means the animal that stood up may never have walked on its knuckles at all. It was some kind of ape in the trees, climbing, hanging, generalized, and one branch of it came down and never went back. And one final note on words, because the literature is a minefield. Hominin equals us and everything on our side of the split from chimps. Hominid equals all the great apes, including chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and us. Older books use hominid to mean what this book means by hominin, which has confused a great many people. This chapter says hominin always and means our branch. Standing up. Bipedalism is the founding hominin trait. It came first. It came alone. It came before the tools, before the fire, before the brain, before everything. And it is present in the very earliest candidates for membership in our lineage. So why did it happen? Nobody knows for certain, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But several pressures were probably pushing at once. It's cheap. This is the strongest argument, and it surprises people. Human walking is remarkably energy efficient, substantially cheaper per kilometer than a chimpanzee's knuckle walking. If you're an ape foraging across a patchy landscape where the food is scattered and the distances are long, that efficiency is not a detail. It's the difference between making it to the next feeding site with something left over and not. It frees the hands permanently. A chimpanzee can carry things, but only by hobbling along on 3 limbs or by clutching things awkwardly and moving slowly. A biped can carry a full armload and walk all day at normal speed. Think about what that opens. You can carry food, which means you can bring a windfall back to your group instead of eating it where you stand. You can carry an infant that can't cling. You can carry water. You can carry tools from where you made them to where you need them. An animal that can move a surplus is an animal that can share and provision and plan for later. Everything social follows from that. It keeps you cool. In the tropics, at midday, the sun is directly overhead. A quadruped presents its entire long back to that sun, like a solar panel. A biped presents only its head and shoulders, a fraction of the surface area. And standing lifts the whole body up out of the hot, still layer of air hugging the baked ground into the cooler, moving air above it. Hold on to this one. It is going to become very important indeed. It lets you reach. Standing gets you at fruit and low branches. Chimps and gorillas already stand bipedally to feed. The behavior is right there, available, in our closest relatives, ready to be extended. And it lets you see and be seen. Standing lifts your eyes above tall grass to spot the leopard, and it makes you look bigger to whatever you're threatening. One myth to bury. The old story said we stood up when the forest dried into savanna, forcing us out into the open grass. It's too simple, and the evidence doesn't support it. The earliest bipeds appear to have lived in mosaics, patchy woodland with clearings, not open plains. Bipedalism most likely evolved in the trees, or at their edge, among apes that were still climbing. It only later turned out to be spectacularly useful in open country, which by now you should recognize as exactly the pattern this entire book keeps repeating. The trait evolves in one context for one reason and finds its real destiny somewhere else entirely. What it costs to stand. Standing up is not a posture. It is a complete reconstruction of the vertebrate skeleton, a body that has been horizontal for 350 million years, tipped up onto one end. And nearly everything distinctive about your body below the neck is a consequence. Your skull sits on top of your spine. In a 4-legged animal, the hole where the spinal cord enters the skull, the foramen magnum, is at the back, because the head hangs forward off a horizontal neck. In you, it's at the bottom, because your head is balanced on top of a vertical column, like a ball on a stick. This is the single most useful clue in all of paleoanthropology. Hand a scientist a skull fragment, no legs, no pelvis, nothing else. And if they can see where the foramen magnum sits, they can tell you whether the animal walked upright. It's usually the first thing they look for. Your spine is an S, and ape's spine is a single gentle C curve. Yours has 2 opposing curves, one in the neck, one in the lower back, stacked into an S. That S does 2 things. It stacks your center of mass directly over your hips so you don't topple, and it acts as a spring, absorbing the shock of every footfall before it reaches your skull. Your pelvis is a bowl. An ape's pelvis is a tall, flat blade. Yours is short, broad, and curved, a basin that holds your guts up from underneath, and that swings the hip muscles around to the side of the joint, where they can brace your body over one leg at a time. Which is what walking actually is, if you've never thought about it. Falling forward and catching yourself over and over on one leg at a time. Every step is a controlled collapse. Half of every stride, you are standing on one foot, and if the muscles on that side didn't clamp down and hold your pelvis level, you'd fall over sideways. Your thigh bones angle inward. They run from wide hips down to narrow knees, so your feet land close to the midline, under your center of mass. Without this, walking would be a lurching side-to-side waddle. It's called the valgus angle, and it's why your knees are closer together than your hips. Your knee locks. Fully straight, held with almost no muscular effort. This is why you can stand around for an hour without getting tired, and a chimpanzee can't. And your foot stopped being a hand. This is the big one, the sacrifice. An ape's foot is a hand. It has an opposable big toe. It grips. A chimpanzee has 4 hands and can hang from a branch by its feet, and a baby chimp holds onto its mother with all 4. Your foot cannot grip anything. Your big toe has been swung around into line with the others, locked in place, and turned into the last point of contact in a push-off. Your foot bones have been vaulted into arches, a longitudinal arch running front to back, and a transverse arch running side to side, which flatten as you land, storing energy, and then snap back and hand it to you as you push off. Your foot is a spring, and it is a lever, and it is one of the most beautifully engineered structures in your body, and it can never again hold on to a branch. Read that as the commitment it was. Our ancestors traded away the ability to climb, a skill their ancestors had used continuously for 50 million years, in exchange for the ability to walk. It is irreversible. It is total. And whatever was driving them to the ground must have been ferocious to be worth that price. And here's the bill, which you personally are paying. Evolution does not get to start over. It cannot go back to the drawing board and design a proper bipedal vertebrate. It can only take a quadruped, a fish, ultimately refitted for land, and tip it up onto its hind legs and cope with the consequences. The consequences are, your back hurts, because your spine evolved as a horizontal beam, with the organs slung underneath it like cargo on a bridge, and it has been stood on end and turned into a column that now carries all that weight in compression, down its own length. Around 80% of people will have significant back pain in their lives. This is why. Your knees blow out, because they take your entire body weight at an angle on one leg at a time for a lifetime. You get hernias and pelvic floor disorders, because your abdominal organs, which for 300 million years rested on the floor of the belly, supported from the side, are now stacked vertically and pressing straight down on the muscular sling at the bottom of your pelvis, which has to hold them there all day, forever. You get varicose veins, because your blood has to be pushed back up from your feet, against gravity, through 1.5 meters of vein. And childbirth may kill you, which is such an enormous consequence that it gets its own section. None of this is bad design. It's history. It's what happens when you take a body that was assembled for one purpose over hundreds of millions of years and stand it upright and ask it to keep working. You are a repurposed animal and it aches. The first of us. The earliest hominins are fragmentary and their status is argued over, which is precisely what you'd expect for fossils sitting right next to the split, when we'd barely started diverging from the chimpanzee line and the differences were still slight. Sahelanthropus chidensis, about 7 million years old, from Chad. Known mainly from one badly crushed skull, nicknamed Taume, which means hope of life in the local language. And its foramen magnum sits relatively far forward, a hint of an upright posture, and an animal from almost exactly the time of the split. Is it a hominin or an ape just on the other side of the line? Genuinely contested, which is the honest state of the evidence, and it's exactly what you should expect this close to a branching point. Orintugenensis, about 6 million years old, from Kenya. Fragments of thigh bone showing the internal architecture of a bone that was bearing weight the way a biped's does. Ardipithecus ramidus, about 4.4 million years old, from Ethiopia. And Ardi is worth dwelling on because she is a beautiful mess. Her skeleton took 15 years to excavate and reconstruct. The bones were so fragile that the earth around them had to be lifted out entire and hardened before anything could be freed. When the description was finally published in 2009, it showed something wonderful. Ardi had a grasping, opposable big toe, a foot that could still hold a branch. And Ardi had a pelvis with bipedal adaptations, a hip built partly for walking. She was both. A climber in the trees and a walker on the ground. Not a transitional smudge, but a functioning animal doing 2 things at once, in a woodland 4.5 million years ago. And she had small canine teeth, which in primates almost always means reduced fighting between males. Something had already shifted in how these animals lived with each other, millions of years before their brains grew at all. 3 million years of not getting smarter. By 4 million years ago, the hominins are unambiguous. They walk. Fully, obligately, permanently. The genus is called Australopithecus, southern ape, and it runs the show for the next 2 million years. And it proves this chapter's point with such brutal clarity that it ought to be printed on the wall of every museum. Australopithecus afarensis is the best known thanks to Lucy, a skeleton about 40% complete, found at Hadar in Ethiopia in 1974, about 3.2 million years old, named for the Beatles song that was playing on a tape deck at the camp the night she was found. Lucy was an adult female, and she was tiny, about 1.1 meters tall, 3.5 feet, and roughly 29 kilograms, 65 pounds. Her pelvis, her femur, and her knee are unmistakable. She was an obligate biped. She walked upright, permanently, as her only means of getting around. And her brain was about 400 to 450 cubic centimeters. A chimpanzee's brain is about 350 to 400. She was, cognitively, an ape. There is no meaningful evidence that she made stone tools. She did not have fire. She did not have language. She had no art, no clothing, no shelter she built, and nothing to suggest she was smarter than a chimp. And she walked across the ground on 2 legs, with her hands free, exactly as you do. And her people did it for millions of years. Take that in. Bipedalism did not trigger intelligence. It was not a stepping stone. It did not lead anywhere for an immensely long time. It was simply a successful way of being an ape, and it worked, unimproved, for a span of time longer than the entire subsequent history of the genus Homo. Whatever eventually grew are brains. It was not standing up. The standing had been done and paid for, and had produced no cognitive dividend whatsoever, for 3 million years, before anything else happened at all. And they weren't alone, either. The Australopiths were a bush of their own. The most striking branch is often given its own genus, Paranthropus, the robust Australopiths, and they are magnificent. They evolved enormous jaws. Vast, flat molars, 4 times the area of ours, for grinding. Flaring cheekbones, swept out wide to make room for chewing muscles the size of your fist. And in Paranthropus boisei, nicknamed Nutcracker Man, a sagittal crest. A ridge of bone running along the top of the skull like a keel, whose only purpose is to give the chewing muscle somewhere to anchor, because there was no longer enough room on the sides of the head. A gorilla has one. A lion has one. And so did this hominin, because it had committed, completely, to a life of eating tough, low-quality plant food and grinding it, hour after hour, day after day. They were superb at it. They lived alongside early Homo for more than 1 million years. And then, about 1.2 million years ago, they went extinct anyway, which is a lesson worth carrying. Being extremely good at one thing is not a survival strategy. It's a bet. And it can be called in. The dilemma. Before the brain can grow, we have to deal with what standing up did to the pelvis, because it sets a hard limit on everything that follows. Bipedalism reshaped the pelvis, short, broad, bow-like. Excellent for walking. And in doing so, it took the wide, straight, simple birth canal of an ape and turned it into a narrow, twisted, awkwardly shaped passage, with the widest dimension running one way at the entrance and the other way at the exit. And then the brain started growing. This is the obstetrical dilemma, and it is a genuine, irreconcilable conflict between 2 things the body needs at once. A pelvis narrow enough to walk efficiently. A birth canal wide enough to pass a large-headed infant. You cannot have both. The consequence is that human childbirth is uniquely dangerous. Not difficult. Uniquely, among all mammals, dangerous. A human infant's head does not simply pass through. It must rotate, mid-passage, turning within the canal to align its widest dimension with the pelvis's widest dimension at each stage, entering one way and emerging another. Human babies are characteristically born facing backward, away from the mother, which is one reason a mother cannot easily reach down and guide her own child out. Almost every other primate gives birth alone and can. Humans, essentially alone among primates, need help. Human birth is normally assisted, it has been, for as long as there have been humans. And before modern medicine, a horrifying number of women and infants died anyway. Evolution's compromise was to eject the baby early. Human infants are born absurdly, dangerously underdeveloped, a state called being secondarily altricial, meaning we became helpless after having ancestors who weren't. Consider the comparison. A newborn foal stands within an hour and runs within a day. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur unaided immediately and be carried. A newborn human can do nothing. Cannot walk, crawl, roll over, hold up its own head, cling, feed itself, or move away from danger. It cannot even reliably regulate its own temperature. It is, in every meaningful sense, not finished. Its brain is only about 25 to 30% of adult size at birth. A chimp's is closer to 40%. And it keeps growing at a fetal rate, the pace of growth it had inside the womb, for roughly the first year after birth, which is why some people call the first year the fourth trimester. A human baby spends its first year of life as, in effect, an externalized fetus, still gestating out in the open air. And this catastrophe turned out to be the greatest gift in the history of our species. Because think about where that brain is now doing its growing. Not in the warm, dark silence of the uterus, wiring itself according to a genetic blueprint with no input from anywhere. Out here, in a world of faces, of voices, of hands and language and firelight and other people, of things to look at and reach for and drop and be surprised by. The human brain does the majority of its wiring, while immersed in the world it will have to live in, shaped by that world, tuned to that world, learning that world's language and that world's faces and that world's rules. At the exact moment when its neurons are laying down connections at a rate they will never approach again. A pelvis reshaped for walking forced us to be born unfinished. And being born unfinished is why we can learn anything. And it has one more consequence, which is going to matter enormously. An infant that helpless cannot be raised by one person. It cannot cling, so it must be carried. It cannot follow, so it must be watched. It cannot feed itself for years. It is an immense burden, far beyond what an ape mother, foraging for herself, could carry alone. Human helplessness demands human cooperation. It is not optional. It is built into the anatomy. We are the species that had to learn to help each other, because our children arrived broken. The runner. Around 2.8 to 2.5 million years ago, in an Africa that was becoming drier and less predictable, the brains finally start to grow. Homo appears. Homo habilis, handyman around 2.4 to 1.5 million years ago, with a brain of roughly 600 to 700 centimeters to the power of 3, clearly above the Australopith range. Named for its association with the first well-documented stone tools, although we should be honest. We don't actually know for certain which species made the earliest tools, and stone tools now show up in the record before the earliest confirmed Homo. And then, around 1.9 million years ago, comes the animal that changes everything. Homo erectus. Brain, 900 to 1,100 centimeters to the power of 3. Well over half of ours. That's remarkable enough. But it's the body that will stop your heart. In 1984, at Nariakadome on the shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya, Kamoya Kimyu found a scrap of skull in a dry riverbed. What came out of the ground over the following seasons was a nearly complete skeleton of an adolescent boy, about 1.6 million years old. The Turkana boy is, from the neck down, essentially a modern human. Tall, long-legged, narrow-hipped. A barrel-shaped rib cage, not the funnel-shaped, gut-heavy cone of an ape. Long, striding, athletic. This is not an ape with modifications. This is a human body, walking around Africa 1.5 million years before there were humans in it. And it is, very specifically, a body built to run. The runner's body. The endurance running hypothesis, argued most forcefully by Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman, makes a claim that sounds absurd until you look at the evidence. Humans are among the greatest endurance runners on Earth. Not sprinters. We're pathetic sprinters. Any dog can outrun us. A squirrel can outrun us. A cheetah does 100 kilometers per hour, and we manage about 40 for 10 seconds. But over distance and heat, we are freakish. A trained human can run down a horse over 30 kilometers on a hot day. And there is an annual race in Wales where humans and horses compete and the human sometimes wins. Almost nothing else can do this. And the evidence for it is written all over the Homo erectus skeleton. The nuchal ligament, a band of elastic tissue running from the back of the skull down to the spine, stopping the head from pitching forward and back as the body bounces. Chimpanzees don't have one. Australopiths didn't have one. Homo does. And who else has one? Dogs, horses, runners. Who doesn't? Pigs, apes, non-runners. It is a diagnostic feature of an animal built to run, and it appears in our lineage precisely when the running body appears. The gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in your body and the one you're sitting on. An ape's is small. Now here's the thing. It barely fires when you walk. Walk across the room with your hand on your backside and feel how little it does. Now run, and it clenches like a fist with every stride. Its job is to stop your trunk from pitching forward when your foot hits the ground and your whole body wants to fold over it. You have a gigantic backside because you evolved to run. The Achilles tendon and the arch of your foot. These are springs. They stretch as you land, storing elastic energy, and release it as you push off, recycling something like half the energy of every stride. Free energy on every step for as long as you keep going. Chimpanzees have neither. No Achilles tendon worth the name, no spring in the foot. Short toes. Great for running, long toes get in the way and cost energy. Useless for gripping. We gave up the gripping. Enlarged semicircular canals in the inner ear, the balance organs of Chapter 7, expanded in Homo to stabilize the gaze while the head is being jolted. And a narrow waist that lets your torso twist against your hips, which is why, when you run, your arms swing. They swing to cancel out the angular momentum of your legs so that you don't spin. Try running with your arms pinned to your sides. You'll feel your whole body start to corkscrew. Every one of these is a running adaptation. None of them existed in Lucy. The sweat. But none of it would work without the thing that actually makes humans terrifying. We sweat. Not like other mammals sweat. We have somewhere between 2 and 5 million eccrine sweat glands, spread across our skin at a density found in no other primate. And we can pour out liters of water an hour and cool ourselves by evaporation across an almost completely bare body surface. And Chapter 10 told you where these came from. The sweat glands of the earliest mammals evolved for thermoregulation in a small nocturnal animal, in the dark under the dinosaurs. Here's the payoff. Almost every other large mammal cools itself by panting. And a four-legged animal cannot pant properly while it gallops, because when a quadruped runs, its gait and its breathing are mechanically locked together. The body compresses and expands with each stride, and the lungs go with it. 1 breath per stride, whether it needs more or not. A galloping antelope cannot choose to breathe faster. It is trapped in its own rhythm. A biped is not. Your breathing is completely decoupled from your legs. You can run at one rhythm and breathe at another. And you were never panting anyway, you were sweating the whole time. So consider what happens on a hot African afternoon. You find an antelope and you walk toward it. It runs away, fast, easily, contemptuously. It's built for exactly this. It leaves you far behind. And you follow. At a jog, steadily. Tracking it. It has to stop because it's overheating, it must stop and stand in the shade and pant and dump heat. And before it has finished cooling, you come over the rise again, still jogging, still sweating, still perfectly comfortable. So it runs again. And now it's starting from a higher temperature than last time. And you follow. And it stops. And you appear. And it runs. You do this for 4 hours in the midday heat. And eventually, the antelope simply stops running because its core temperature has climbed past the point where its muscles will work. And it stands there, staggering, hyperthermic, unable to flee. And you walk up to it? This is called persistence hunting, and it has been documented among the San of the Kalahari and other foraging peoples. And it is a way of killing a large animal with no weapons at all. No claws, no fangs, no speed, no strength, no spear. Just legs, sweat glands, patience, and the ability to keep track of where something went. That is what we were, before the tools got good. A relentless, tireless, thermally invincible thing that would simply not stop coming. And the hair, which is why you're naked. Fur is a catastrophe for a sweating animal. It traps the moisture against the skin, where it cannot evaporate, and evaporation is the entire mechanism. To sweat effectively, you must be bare. So we lost the 4 genetic evidence from lice, of all things, supports this. Human head lice and body lice diverged at a point that suggests substantial hair loss, at least 1 million years ago, right around the Homo erectus body plan. Body lice live in clothing. Their existence and their divergent state is a clue about when we started wearing it. And the hair we kept is on the top of our heads, which is precisely the surface that a standing biped presents to a tropical overhead sun, a patch of insulation, exactly where an upright animal needs it and nowhere else. Your baldness and your hair are both consequences of the same afternoon chase. The fire. Homo erectus left Africa. First of all our lineage to do it, reaching Georgia by about 1.8 million years ago, and eventually Java and China. It survived for well over 1.5 million years, which makes it a far more successful species than we have yet proven ourselves to be. And it is associated, though the earliest dates are debated, with the controlled use of fire. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis argues that fire wasn't merely useful. It was transformative, and you can read it in the bones. Cooking is external digestion. Heat unwinds proteins and bursts starch granules before the food enters your body, doing, outside, the work your gut would otherwise have to do inside. It massively increases the calories you actually extract from a given amount of food, and it collapses the time you have to spend chewing. A gorilla spends something like half its waking life chewing. A chimpanzee spends about 6 hours a day with food in its mouth. You spend about an hour. And here's the anatomy. Homo erectus has smaller teeth and smaller jaws than an Australopith. And its narrow-waisted, barrel-chested torso implies something else. A much smaller gut. The big pot belly of an ape, the enormous fermenting vat needed to extract calories from tough raw plants, shrank. Which brings us to a beautiful piece of accounting called the expensive tissue hypothesis. Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler. Gut tissue is metabolically expensive. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive. Both of them cost enormously per gram, and a body has only so much energy to spend. So, the gut shrank, and the brain grew, and the budget balanced. Cooking didn't just feed us. Cooking paid for the brain. We are the ape that outsourced its digestion to a fire and spent the savings on neurons. The hand meets the stone. Chapter 11 built you a hand in the treetops, a hand for gripping swaying branches and plucking small things from twigs. Here it picks up a rock. Lemequian, 3.3 million years ago. Kenya, the oldest known stone tools, and they predate the genus Homo entirely, which means they were probably made by an Australopith. Crude, large, heavy, minimally worked, but intentional. Oldowan, 2.6 to 1.7 Maya, simple and utterly transformative. The technique, take a core of stone. Strike it with a hammerstone at the right angle with the right force. A flake comes off. And the flake is the point. Because a freshly struck stone flake has an edge sharper than anything in the hominin body. Sharper than our teeth, which are flat and blunt. Sharper than our nails, which are pathetic. Sharper, in fact, than a modern steel scalpel, obsidian flakes are still occasionally used in surgery for exactly this reason. And a sharp edge is a door into a food source we could not otherwise touch. We have no claws. We have no carnassial shearing teeth. Hand an unarmed human a dead zebra, and they cannot get into it. The hide is too tough, and we have nothing that will cut it. With a flake, we can. We can open the hide and cut meat off the bone, and with a hammerstone, crack the bones open for marrow, which is dense, fatty, and nutritionally spectacular, and which even hyenas often leave behind. Because most bones are too much trouble. And we know they did this because the cut marks are on the fossil bones. Stone tool scars on animal bones, 2.6 million years old. Acheulean, 1.76 Maya onward, associated with Homo erectus, and it is a genuine leap. The signature tool is the bifacial hand axe, a teardrop, worked on both faces, symmetrical, standardized. And standardized is the word that matters. An old down flake is opportunistic. You hit the rock, you take what comes off. An Acheulean hand axe is made to a design. The napper is not exploiting a lucky fracture. The napper has a shape in mind before the first blow, and is executing a planned sequence of strikes to arrive at it. That requires holding an abstract goal in your head and working toward it through steps that don't individually resemble the goal. And it requires something else, because napping cannot be learned alone. It is genuinely hard. The angles are unforgiving. Trial and error will not get you there in a lifetime. You have to be shown. Which means Acheulean hand axes are physical evidence of teaching, of one hominin deliberately transmitting a difficult skill to another, over years on purpose. And then they made the same hand axe for 1,000,000 years. That's the other thing about the Acheulean, and it's chilling. The design barely changes. Across 3 continents and more than 1,000,000 years, the hand axe stays essentially the same. Whatever was going on in those heads, it was not yet the restless, endlessly improving, cumulative culture of later humans. They could learn. They could teach. They could not, apparently, innovate. Something was still missing, and the hand and the tool built each other. Compare your hand to a chimpanzee's. Yours has a longer, stronger, far more mobile thumb, and shorter, straighter fingers. The chimp's long, curved fingers make a fabulous hook for hanging from branches and a poor pincer. Its short thumb can barely reach. Yours is the reverse. You gave up the hook. What you got is a precision grip, thumb pad meeting fingertip pad, squarely, with force, and a squeeze grip that can clamp a hammerstone and drive it with power and control. The hominin hand was selected, in part, for napping. The tool shaped the hand as surely as the hand shaped the tool. Your hand is not merely capable of using tools. Your hand was carved by them. The brain and the bill. Here's what happened to hominin brains. Roughly a tripling in about 3,000,000 years. That is extraordinarily fast, by the standards of anything in this book. And it wasn't uniform. The parts that grew disproportionately were the prefrontal cortex, and the association areas, the regions for planning, inhibition, abstraction, and reasoning about other minds. And now look at that table again. Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. That is not a typo, and it is not a fluke of a single specimen. Neanderthal cranial capacity averaged larger than modern human cranial capacity, consistently, which should permanently cure you of the idea that raw brain volume is intelligence. It isn't. Organization matters, connectivity matters, how the brain develops matters, body size matters. By the crudest available measure, we were not the smartest hominin who ever lived. We were merely the one that survived. What it costs. Your brain is about 2% of your body weight and consumes about 20% of your resting energy. In a newborn, it's closer to 60%. It requires a childhood a decade long to program. It made childbirth lethal. A trait that expensive must be paying for itself enormously. Nothing that costly survives unless it earns. What paid? No single thing. A loop. And every strand feeds every other one. Food, meat, marrow, cooked calories. The expensive tissue hypothesis gives the mechanism. The gut shrank, and the brain grew into the space in the budget. Each other, Chapter 11's social brain, but now in larger, more cooperative groups, with deeper alliances, richer politics, and much heavier demands on modeling other people's minds. Grandmothers. This deserves its own paragraph, because it is one of the loveliest arguments in anthropology. Humans are cooperative breeders. Uniquely, among apes, a human mother does not raise her children alone. Fathers help, siblings help, aunts help, and, above all, grandmothers help. And there's a genuine biological puzzle that this solves. Human females live 4 decades past menopause. They stop reproducing, and then keep living, healthily, for 30 or 40 more years. That makes no sense at all under simple evolutionary logic. Natural selection cares only about reproduction. An animal that stops reproducing should, by that logic, be invisible to selection, and there should be no pressure to keep it alive and vigorous. Unless, and this is the grandmother hypothesis, argued by Kristen Hawkes and others, post-reproductive women were increasing the survival of their grandchildren, foraging for them, carrying them, feeding them, watching them, teaching them, freeing their daughters to have the next child sooner. A grandmother who stops having babies of her own and instead invests everything in her daughter's babies can put more of her genes into the future than one who kept trying to reproduce. Menopause may be an adaptation for grandmothering, and cooperative breeding is the economic foundation of the human brain, because a helpless, slow-growing, ruinously expensive infant is simply not affordable for one exhausted mother. It only works if a group raises the child. The village is not a nice idea. It is a metabolic necessity. Culture. Once knowledge can be accumulated across generations, then a brain better able to soak it up is a brain with an advantage. So culture starts selecting for brains, and the brains produce more culture, and the loop tightens on itself. Biologists call it gene-culture coevolution, and it may be the fastest engine of change our species has ever had. And an unstable world. The Pleistocene climate lurched, ice ages arriving and retreating, forests becoming grassland and back again, on timescales of thousands of years. And when the environment won't hold still, there is no such thing as a good specialization. What wins is flexibility, a general-purpose problem solver that can figure out whatever the world has turned into this century. Notice that there is no first cause here. Cooking pays the calories. Cooperative breeding pays the child care. The long childhood buys time to learn. The learning is worth doing because there's a culture to learn. The culture exists because there are brains capable of carrying it. Nothing started it. The loop simply closed, and then it tightened, and it has been tightening ever since. The others. By 500,000 years ago, the world had several kinds of human in it, and they were not stages. They were neighbors. Homo heidelbergensis, widespread, large-brained, plausibly the ancestor of both us and the Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis, Europe, and Western Asia, from about 400,000 to 40,000 years ago. Cold-adapted, short, immensely powerful, barrel-chested, built to hold heat. Bigger brain than we are. And here I want to be very direct, because the Victorian caricature of the shambling, grunting brute has done enormous harm and refuses to die. Neanderthals made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They hunted large, dangerous animals cooperatively, and their skeletons show a distinctive pattern of injuries, concentrated in the head and neck and upper body, that has been compared to the injury profile of rodeo riders, which tells you what close quarters and bush hunting of a large mammal actually involved. They made pigments. They made ornaments. They appear to have buried at least some of their dead, and they cared for the injured. There are Neanderthal skeletons of individuals who lived for years with catastrophic disabilities. A withered arm, a crushed eye socket in blindness, a leg that could not bear weight, teeth worn to nothing. Those people could not have fed themselves. Somebody fed them. For years, they were not a lesser thing. They were another kind of person. Denisovans, and this is one of the strangest entries in the whole story. We know about them primarily from DNA, sequenced out of a finger bone, and a couple of teeth from a cave in Siberia, before we had any real skeleton at all. A human species discovered by genetics, not by paleontology. They existed. They spread across Asia. We can read their genome. We still barely know what they look like. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of the Indonesian island of Flores, about 1.1 meters tall, with a brain of about 400 centimeters to the power of 3, Australopith-sized, chimp-sized, and yet apparently making tools and hunting. Most likely a case of insular dwarfism, a large-bodied species marooned on a small island with limited food, shrinking, generation by generation, because on an island small is cheap and large is fatal. The same island at the same time had dwarf elephants and giant rats. Islands do strange things. Homo naledi, small-brained, from South Africa, found deep inside a nearly inaccessible cave chamber under circumstances that have prompted controversial claims that the bodies were put there deliberately. And now the sentence this chapter has been building toward. As recently as 60,000 years ago, a blink, roughly 2,000 generations, a span of time within which your own family history is a rounding error, the Earth was home to Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, and possibly late surviving Homo erectus. At least 5 or 6 kinds of human, alive, at the same time, on the same planet. A traveler could, in principle, have crossed Eurasia and met several different species of people. Today there is one, and we find that so utterly normal that it doesn't even occur to us to find it strange, which is itself the most telling fact of all. We have no memory of the world in which we were one kind of human among many, because there has been nobody else here for a very long time, and we have grown used to the silence. Us. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens shows up in Africa by around 300,000 years ago. The earliest known fossils come from Jebel Irhoud, in Morocco, about 315,000 years old, and that find did 2 things at once. It pushed the date back substantially, and it moved the map. Not a single East African cradle from which we all descend, but something more like a Pan-African origin. Modern features assembling piecemeal across a continent's worth of interconnected populations, mixing and separating, and mixing again. What makes a skull modern? A globular brain case, round, high, ballooning up and back, rather than the long, low vault of a Neanderthal. A flat face tucked under the brain rather than jutting forward. Small brow ridges. And, uniquely among all hominins that have ever lived, a chin. Nothing else has one. Not Neanderthals, not Erectus, not any Australopith. Just us. And here's the delightful part. Nobody knows what it's for. It has been proposed as a buttress against chewing stress, a byproduct of the face shrinking, a sexual signal, a speech-related structure. The arguments continue. The single most distinctive feature of the modern human skull is an unsolved problem. The puzzle, and now the thing that keeps anthropologists up at night. We had modern bodies and modern brains for well over 100,000 years before we started behaving like modern humans. Skulls indistinguishable from yours, at 300,000 years ago. Brains as large as yours, and heads shaped like yours, and for an enormously long time. Not much happens. No cave paintings, no sculpture, no sewing needles, no complex multi-part tools, no trade networks, no burial with grave goods, no sign of the restless, accumulating, endlessly innovating culture that we think of as us. What were we doing for 100,000 years? The old story, the human revolution, a sudden switch flipping around 40,000 years ago, has been substantially dismantled. What the African record actually shows is not a void followed by an explosion. It's glimmers, appearing early, and getting steadily denser. Engraved ochre at Blombus Cave, South Africa, 75,000 years ago. A piece of red pigment scratched with a deliberate crosshatched geometric pattern. It means nothing to us. It meant something to somebody. Shell beads, drilled and strung, from North Africa and the Levant, 100,000 years old or more. Somebody wanted to be looked at. Pigment processing. Long-distance transport of materials. The scattered, early, undeniable evidence of minds that were doing more than surviving. And then, in the Upper Paleolithic, from around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, the record detonates. Chauvet Cave, France, 32,000 years ago. Lions, rhinos, horses, bison, rendered on stone walls with a control of line, shading, and perspective that would not disgrace a modern studio. Some of the animals are drawn with multiple superimposed legs to suggest motion. The artists use the natural bulges of the rock to give the animals volume. Lascaux, 17,000 years ago. Figurative sculpture. Bone needles, which means sewn, fitted clothing, which means you can survive an ice age period. Fish hooks, bows, and flutes carved from the wing bones of vultures that still play, and whose scale is recognizably musical. What changed? 3 candidates. A change in the brain, some genetic mutation affecting how the brain was wired. This is the classic cognitive revolution idea. It is now widely regarded as unnecessary and unsupported, though it retains defenders. A change in the number of us. And this one is beautiful, because it requires no change in the brain at all. Consider a small, isolated band of 40 people. Someone in it works out how to make a really good bone needle. It's a difficult skill. She teaches 2 people. Then a bad winter comes, and both of them die, and the knowledge is simply gone. It has to be reinvented from nothing. Now, consider a network of thousands of people, in contact, trading, intermarrying, meeting seasonally. Now the needlemaker teaches 20 people, and they teach others, and the knowledge is redundantly stored across a whole population, and it cannot be lost. And because it can't be lost, the next generation doesn't have to reinvent it, they can improve it. Below a certain population density, culture leaks away as fast as it accumulates. Above it, culture ratchets. On this account, nothing whatsoever changed inside the skull. What changed was the number of skulls in contact with one another. This idea has gained substantial ground. Or, it was gradual all along, and the explosion is partly an illusion produced by where archaeologists have historically dug. Europe, and what happens to survive? Not much. Modern behavior may have assembled slowly and patchily across Africa over 200,000 years, and we simply weren't looking in the right places. Language, and underneath all of it, almost certainly, language. It is maddening to study, because speech does not fossilize. There's nothing to dig up. We have only indirect clues. The hyoid bone in the throat, which is present in essentially modern in Neanderthals. The hypoglossal canal, the channel carrying the nerve that drives the tongue, and the gene FOXP2, whose disruption causes severe speech and language impairment in living people. And here's a fact that dismantled a very popular story. Neanderthals had the modern version of FOXP2. The old picture, one magic language gene, unique to us, that switched on and made us human, is dead. Whatever it was, it wasn't that. But whatever language is, we know exactly what it does, and it is unlike anything else in the living world. Human language is generative. A finite vocabulary and a finite set of rules produce an infinite number of possible meanings. You have, in your life, understood thousands of sentences that had never been spoken before, including several in this chapter, which I made up as I went. It is recursive. Structures nest inside structures, without limit. I know that you think that she believes that they suspect. Forever if you like, and most importantly, it permits displacement. You can talk about what is not here. The past, the future, the hypothetical, the far away, the imaginary, the counterfactual, the false. No other animal signal does this. A vervet monkey's alarm call means eagle now, here. It cannot mean there was an eagle yesterday, or there might be an eagle tomorrow, or let's go where the eagles aren't, or imagine an eagle. And displacement is what makes cumulative culture possible, because it means knowledge can be transmitted with high fidelity, and then modified, and passed on again. A lifetime of hard-won knowledge can be handed to someone in an afternoon. That is a ratchet. Each generation starts where the last one stopped, instead of starting over. It clicks forward, and it does not slip back. No other species on Earth has this, and it is the entire reason that a slow, weak, clawless, fangless primate, a creature that cannot outrun a dog, cannot fight a leopard, and cannot survive a cold night without a fire it must be taught to make, is the only animal that has ever had to pass laws restraining what it is capable of doing to its own planet. Out, and alone, Homo sapiens left Africa in waves, and the Great Dispersal, the one that produced every non-African population alive, happened roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, and it was fast. Australia by 65,000 to 50,000 years ago. Stop on that. Australia has never been connected to Asia by land. Reaching it required crossing open ocean, out of sight of land, which means boats, which means the design of boats, the making of boats, the ability to plan a voyage into an unknown emptiness, and enough people to found a population, when you got there. 50,000 years ago. Nobody knows how. Europe by 45,000 years ago. The Americas by at least 16,000 years ago, and probably earlier, across Beringia. Within a few tens of thousands of years, one African primate had walked, sailed, or drifted onto every continent on Earth except Antarctica. And we met them? Here is the most extraordinary scientific finding of the last 20 years, and it comes from paleogenomics, the reading of DNA out of ancient bone. Its central figure is Svante Pääbo, who sequenced the Neanderthal genome and won the Nobel Prize for it in 2022, and whose work has rewritten this chapter completely. When Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and encountered the other humans already living there, we did not simply replace them. We interbred with them. Every living person of non-African descent carries roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. If your ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa, then somewhere in your family tree many thousands of generations back, but really, actually there is a Neanderthal. Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry an additional 3 to 5% Denisovan DNA, and some of it does things. A Denisovan version of a gene called EPIS, one is carried by Tibetans, and helps them live at altitudes that would leave the rest of us gasping and ill. Their ability to live on the roof of the world was given to them by another human species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Other archaic variants affect immunity, skin, and hair. Some raise disease risk, which changes the story entirely. The replacement of the other hominins was not clean. It was not a superior species sweeping aside its inferiors. It was messy, contact, coexistence, competition, and children. The genome of nearly every living human is a mosaic, carrying fragments of lineages that no longer exist anywhere else in the universe except inside us. They are not entirely gone. They are in you, and then they were gone. By around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals are finished. The Denisovans gone. Floresiensis gone by around 50,000 years ago. Luzonensis gone. Within a startlingly short window, after Homo sapiens arrives in each region, every other kind of human on Earth disappears. Why? Competition for the same food and the same land. Absorption, being genetically swallowed by a much larger incoming population. Larger social networks and better cultural transmission on our side. Climate stress. Disease. Straightforward violence. Most likely, all of it at once, in different proportions in different places. The causes are argued. The outcome is not. The loop that closed. This chapter began with an ape that had everything it needed, and no reason to use it. Standing up came first, and came alone, and did nothing for the brain for 3 million years. But it reshaped the whole skeleton, the skull's balance point, the S-curve of the spine, the bow of the pelvis, the angle of the thigh, the springing arch of the foot. It cost us the ability to climb, and gave us back pain, and made childbirth deadly. And because it made childbirth deadly, it forced our infants to be born unfinished, so that human brains do most of their growing outside the womb, in a world of faces and voices, wiring themselves to the world they'll live in. And because our infants are helpless, we had to cooperate to raise them, and it freed the hands, permanently. The freed hands found stone, and struck edges sharper than any tooth, and got into meat and marrow that no clawless ape could reach. Fire and cooking took over the work of digestion, shrank the gut, and freed the metabolic budget that a growing brain demanded. The runner's body, Achilles tendon, nuchal ligament, enormous buttocks, bare skin, and millions of sweat glands inherited from a mammal hiding from dinosaurs, made it possible to run an antelope to death in the noonday sun with nothing in your hands at all. Grandmothers and cooperative breeding made the ruinous infant affordable. The long childhood gave the ruinous brain time to be programmed, and language, recursive, generative, and able to speak of what is not there, turned that programming into a ratchet, so that what one human learns need never be learned again. Nothing here is the first cause. Every part of it bought time or energy for every other part. The loop simply closed, and then it tightened, and it has been tightening ever since, faster each turn. And it has not stopped. 7 million years after an ape stood up in an African woodland, its descendants had crossed open ocean to a continent they could not see, painted lions on a cave wall by firelight, carved flutes from the bones of birds, and buried their dead. And they had done it while, one by one, every other kind of human on earth went out. The big-brained ones, the small ones, the ones who cared for their crippled and buried their dead and made ornaments to be admired in, leaving one species, alone on the planet, with no close relatives left anywhere, unable to imagine that it had ever been otherwise.